December 14th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, 3 miles from the Belgian-German border. Snow is coming down sideways through black fir trees, and 8 American soldiers are lying flat in a half-frozen drainage ditch, close enough to hear German voices over the idling engines of half-tracks rolling past less than 40 yards away. None of them know it yet, but they are the only Americans within 5 miles who have seen what's parked in the clearing behind those trees. In 6 days, what they saw in that ravine will either save an entire American division from being caught flat-footed, or get all 8 of them court-martialed for treason. This is 1st Lieutenant Daniel Whitfield's squad. 48 hours earlier, they had been part of a 40-man reconnaissance platoon attached to the 28th Infantry Division, screening a quiet stretch of front that headquarters had, only days before, described as a rest sector, a place to rotate exhausted units for a few weeks of relative calm before the winter push resumed. It was supposed to be the safest ground on the line. Then came the barrage. A short, brutal window of German artillery fire tore through the tree line just after midnight, scattering the platoon across 3 separate patches of forest, collapsing a logging trail on top of their only working jeep, and cutting radio contact between every squad in the platoon. When the smoke and snow settled, Lieutenant Whitfield had 8 men standing around him in the dark, half a torn map, no working radio, and absolutely no idea where the rest of the platoon had gone. They didn't know it that first night, shivering in a collapsed foxhole while snow filled in their tracks, that they were about to stumble onto the staging ground for one of the most heavily guarded logistics operations the German army had planned for that stretch of the front that winter. And Whitfield's decision, in the days that followed, to investigate what he found there instead of simply falling back to safety, is the decision that will define the rest of his life, his career, and the way history remembers a name almost nobody outside that ravine ever learned. For the first 18 hours, survival came before anything else. Whitfield split his 8 men into pairs for security on the move, kept them shifting position at dusk and dawn when visibility was worst for German patrols, and rationed out what little food they'd carried scattered in their packs, not full rations for anyone, but enough to keep 8 exhausted men moving without collapsing. Private First Class Arthur Meeks, the squad's medic, had come out of the blast with a badly sprained ankle, wrapped tight in improvised bandaging and barely able to keep pace. Whitfield made the call early to slow the group's movement rather than leave Meeks behind to catch up on his own. A small decision in the grand sweep of the war, but one that told the rest of the men something important about the kind of officer they were now following through enemy-held forest with no support behind them. Corporal Ray Das, the squad scout, was the one who first noticed something wrong with the ground itself. Fresh tire tracks, deep and heavy, cut through the snow at an angle that didn't match any American vehicle route on their torn map, and they weren't heading toward the front line. They were heading away from it, deeper into forest the maps marked as empty, quiet, and irrelevant to anyone's planning. Whitfield's orders, such as they were, had been simple before the barrage scattered everyone. Find the rest of the platoon, re-establish contact, stay alive until they did. Investigating unexplained enemy vehicle movement in supposedly empty forest wasn't part of that. But the tracks kept nagging at him through that second day, because whatever was moving through this ground was moving in volume, and moving with purpose, in a sector every briefing he'd sat through in the past month had called dead quiet. That second night, radio operator Corporal Sam Bellamy finally managed to coax a weak, broken signal out of the platoon's backup set, cracked but not destroyed in the blast. For nearly 90 seconds, static resolved into fragments of a distress call, not from their own scattered platoon, but from an entirely different American unit, a small supply detachment, somewhere ahead of them and clearly in trouble. Then the set died completely, and no amount of Bellamy's fiddling with the wiring brought it back. It wasn't much. A handful of broken words and a rough direction, gone almost as soon as Bellamy had it. But combined with the tire tracks Doss had found earlier that same day, it was enough to convince Whitfield that whatever was happening deeper in this forest wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't small. Something was moving through ground the U.S. Army believed was empty, and at least one other American unit had already run into it and gone silent trying to say so. That night, huddled around a fireless camp because smoke would have given away their position instantly, the 8 men talked in low voices about what to do next. Private Coyle, the youngest of the group, argued for pushing south immediately and putting distance between themselves and whatever had swallowed that supply detachment. Nobody blamed him for it, but Whitfield noticed that even as Coyle argued for caution, his eyes kept drifting back toward the direction the tracks had come from, the same pull the rest of them were quietly feeling and not yet ready to say out loud. By the morning of the third day, Whitfield's squad had eyes on the source of the tracks, and what they saw through Doss's field glasses didn't match anything in the intelligence briefings any of them had sat through before the offensive season began. German engineers were dragging heavy camouflage netting over a long clearing packed with fuel drums stacked in rows, wooden crates of artillery and small arms ammunition, and parked in ranks under the tree canopy where aerial reconnaissance would never spot them. Far more half-tracks, armored cars, and support vehicles than a simple patrol base in quiet forest should ever require. Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Grier, the squad's most experienced NCO, and a man who had served through 2 prior campaigns before this one, put it into words for the rest of the men crouched beside him in the brush. This wasn't a checkpoint. It wasn't a rear area patrol camp. This was a resupply hub, a marshalling point built to feed a much larger German push that hadn't shown its hand yet anywhere along the line. And by the position of it on Doss's hand-corrected map, it was sitting almost directly behind the thin, undermanned stretch of American front their own division was holding. What made it worse was the fragment of radio traffic Bellamy had caught the night before. Piecing it together with the direction the tracks led and the timing of when the signal had died, Whitfield became increasingly convinced that the missing supply detachment, the one whose distress call Bellamy had barely caught before the radio failed, had stumbled onto this same site days earlier and had been captured or killed before they could get a full report out. If that was true, there was no one else coming to warn the line. No patrol scheduled to sweep this sector, No reconnaissance flight likely to spot camouflaged vehicles under heavy tree cover. Nobody. Just 8 exhausted, half-rationed men with one working rifle cleaning kit, half a map, and a growing certainty that they were the only ones who knew what was sitting behind their own lines. That evening, Whitfield gathered the squad in a shallow hollow behind a fallen log, out of the wind, and laid the choice out plainly, without dressing it up. They could try to slip south under cover of darkness, find friendly lines, and report what they'd seen. A report that would arrive days after the fact, filtered through officers who hadn't seen any of it themselves, and had no particular reason to trust 8 men who'd been missing and unaccounted for since the barrage. Or they could stay, confirm exactly what this depot was feeding and when, and find some way to cripple it before whatever offensive it was supporting could get underway, with no backup, no orders authorizing any of it, and no guarantee that succeeding would matter any more to headquarters than failing would. Private Meeks, still limping on his wrapped ankle, was the first to speak into the silence that followed. "If we're wrong about what this is," he said, "we're deserters who wandered off and got lucky finding our way back. If we're right and we don't do anything about it." He didn't finish the sentence. Nobody made him. Grier spoke next, quieter than usual, and said something that would come back to all of them months later without any of them fully understanding why it stuck. That the Army had a way of forgetting who was right the moment somebody had to explain on paper exactly how they knew it. Nobody thought much of it in the moment. Bellamy would remember it clearly enough to repeat it, almost word for word, from a cot in a division holding area 3 months later, waiting to hear whether his lieutenant was going to prison. They stayed. Whitfield split responsibilities across the squad the way a good officer does under pressure, quickly, clearly, and without pretending any of the 8 men left to him were expendable. Grier would run a rotating 2-man watch on the eastern tree line, logging truck movements and shift changes as precisely as the light allowed. Das, still the squad's most capable scout, would map the depot's perimeter in detail and find an approach that avoided the machine gun position covering the northern edge of the clearing. Bellamy kept working the damaged radio in every spare hour, hoping to get close enough to a relay point that even a broken set might catch a signal out. And PFC Meeks, despite the ankle that still hadn't healed, refused to sit out the planning, insisting on handling the medical and triage side of whatever demolitions team when nobody in the squad argued with him about it twice. The plan that took shape over the following 2 days hinged on a narrow window Grier's watch logs had identified. German fuel convoys were rotating through the depot roughly every 3rd night to resupply forward units, and during that changeover, security along the eastern tree line thinned out for a stretch of roughly 40 minutes while attention shifted to the incoming trucks. If the squad could get close enough during that window to plant explosives against the fuel stacks and the ammunition crates nearest them, and be clear of the ravine before the next patrol rotation came through, they could gut the depot's output without ever having to engage the roughly 90 German troops stationed around it directly. A fight 8 exhausted men had no realistic chance of winning outright. The first attempt went wrong almost as soon as it began. On the second night, Das and Private Coyle got within sight of the fuel stacks, only to find a German sentry posted in a position that hadn't existed the night before. The rotation had shifted without warning. Exactly the kind of variable 8 men with no inside information, had no way to predict. They pulled back before triggering anything, but Coyle came out of it with a shallow graze along his forearm from a near discovery that came within a few feet of turning into a firefight neither side would have walked away from cleanly. It was here, back in the hollow with the whole squad gathered and Coyle's arm freshly bandaged by Meeks, that Whitfield made the call his own men openly doubted to his face. Instead of scrapping the plan for a safer night further out, or falling back to try to reach friendly lines with what they already knew, he decided to move the operation forward by a full 24 hours, betting that the Germans, having just changed their rotation and tightened the perimeter in response to a near miss they may not even have realized happened, would assume they'd already closed the gap and wouldn't expect a second attempt so soon after the first. Grier argued against it hard, in front of the entire squad, calling it a gamble with no margin left in it if anything went wrong twice in a row. Whitfield didn't raise his voice back at him. He simply said that every night they waited gave the Germans more time to finish stockpiling exactly what the squad was trying to destroy, and that the risk of moving too soon was smaller, in his judgment, than the risk of moving too late and finding the depot fully stocked, fully guarded, and already feeding an offensive nobody on the American side had seen coming. There was a moment, the night before they moved, that none of the surviving accounts leave out. Bellamy, still fiddling uselessly with radio parts he'd long since given up on actually repairing, asked Whitfield quietly whether he understood what would happen to all of them if this second attempt went wrong, not just to him, as the officer who'd ordered it, but to every man who followed him back down into that ravine after a near discovery that should reasonably have scared any of them off entirely. Whitfield didn't pretend to have a comforting answer ready. He said only that he understood the stakes better than anyone in the squad, and that he wasn't ordering any man to go who didn't want to go. By morning, all 7 of them had told him, in one way or another, that they were going anyway. They moved the next night. The second attempt happened in near total darkness, with a low fog rolling through the ravine that Whitfield had gambled would still be sitting there at that hour, fog that muffled sound, cut visibility for the German sentries, and gave 8 men a chance the open, moonlit ground of 2 nights earlier never would have offered. Das led Meeks and Coyle in along the same approach as before, timed this time to the exact minute of the rotation gap Grier's watch logs had tracked across 3 separate nights. Bellamy and the rest of the squad held a covering position on the ridge above the clearing, rifles ready, prepared to draw German attention away from the demolitions team if the alarm went up before the charges could be placed. It nearly did. A junior German sentry, walking a line he didn't appear to have walked the previous nights, came within 15 feet of where the charges were being set before turning back toward the incoming trucks. Close enough, Coyle said afterward, that he could hear the man humming quietly to himself in the fog, completely unaware of how close he'd just come to 8 rifles he'd never have seen coming. The charges went into the fuel drums and 2 nearby ammunition crates on a time delay long enough for the demolitions team to clear the ravine and reach the ridge before anything detonated. When it came, the explosion was larger than any of them expected, fuel drums going up in rapid sequence, secondary detonations tearing through the ammunition stores, and lighting the tree line orange for nearly a full minute, visible, Greyer estimated, for miles in every direction through the thinning fog. It didn't just damage the depot. It gutted it, destroying the overwhelming majority of the fuel reserve staged there, and forcing the German unit responsible to divert men, vehicles, and hours to containing the fire, rather than continuing whatever resupply schedule they'd been running toward. Whatever offensive push this depot had been feeding, it had just lost the fuel and ammunition it needed to launch on schedule. 2 days later, moving south through recovered ground as elements of the front shifted in the chaos following the blast, Whitfield's squad finally made contact with an American patrol from their own division. They were malnourished, filthy, one man wounded, all 8 of them running on almost no sleep, and they were carrying a story headquarters had absolutely no interest in hearing: that a junior lieutenant had kept his men behind enemy lines for 6 days, without orders, without radio contact for most of that time, to destroy a target no one at division level had confirmed even existed. Whitfield reported everything, in full detail, sitting across a folding table from a colonel he'd never met, expecting hard questions and getting them. He walked through the tire tracks, the fragment of radio traffic, the depot's layout as DOS had mapped it, the rotation gap Greyer had logged over 3 nights, and the explosion that had lit the tree line orange from the ridge above. He laid out, as clearly as 6 days of exhaustion allowed him to, exactly why he had chosen to stay instead of falling back, and exactly what he believed the depot had been feeding. What he did not expect was the look on that colonel's face by the time he finished: not relief, not curiosity, not even the skepticism of a man who simply needed more proof, but the particular, closed expression of someone who has already decided, before the report is even finished, not to believe a word of it. The colonel thanked him for his time, told him the squad would be held for debriefing, and said nothing else. It was the last ordinary conversation Whitfield would have with a superior officer for nearly 3 months. The suspicion started almost immediately, and it didn't fade the way Whitfield assumed it would once someone actually went and looked. Division intelligence had no record of any depot in that sector. No aerial reconnaissance flight in the previous month had flagged unusual vehicle concentrations in that stretch of forest. To the officers reviewing Whitfield's report, the simplest explanation wasn't that 8 exhausted men had found something the entire intelligence apparatus had missed. It was that a lieutenant with no radio contact for 6 days had gone rogue somewhere behind enemy lines, engaged in unauthorized offensive action on his own initiative, and was now constructing an elaborate justification for it after the fact, with 7 other men who had every reason to back his story. Within a week, Whitfield was formally charged: conduct unbecoming an officer, and, far more seriously in the eyes of the review board, acting without orders in a manner that had needlessly risked American lives and potentially provoked unconfirmed enemy retaliation in a sector command had, until that point, considered stable and low priority. Grier, Doss, Bellamy, Meeks, and the rest of the squad were held separately as witnesses, their individual statements taken apart from one another, compared line by investigators who seemed, to Grier at least, more interested in finding inconsistencies to build a case than in understanding what had actually happened in that ravine. The court-martial opened in early January of 1945 in a requisitioned schoolhouse a few miles behind the lines, its blackboard still faintly chalked with lessons from children who'd been evacuated months earlier. Whitfield sat through 3 days of testimony, his own and his men's, watching the prosecution build a picture of a squad that had, in their telling, simply gone missing for 6 days and returned with a convenient story about a target no one else could verify. The panel kept circling back to the same central question, phrased slightly differently each time it came up. Lieutenant Whitfield had no authorization to remain behind enemy lines past his original orders. He had no authorization to conduct an unsupported demolitions raid on a target division intelligence had never confirmed existed. And beyond his own squad's testimony, men who, the prosecution pointed out more than once, had every personal incentive to support their commanding officer's version of events, given that their own conduct during those 6 days was also under review. There was no independent proof that the depot he claimed to have destroyed had ever posed the threat he insisted it did. Grier took the stand on the second day and gave his account plainly, without embellishment, describing the tracks, the watch logs, the near discovery, and the explosion exactly as he'd seen them. Under cross-examination, he was asked directly whether he had ever considered refusing Whitfield's order to move the operation forward by 24 hours after the first attempt failed. He said he had considered it and had argued against the decision at the time, and had gone anyway because he trusted the officer giving it. The prosecutor treated the answer as evidence of blind loyalty rather than sound judgment, and moved on before Grier could say anything further. Early in the proceedings, almost in passing, one member of the panel had asked Whitfield whether he understood that officers who acted this far outside the chain of command sometimes never returned to active duty at all, regardless of outcome. A line that landed in the room like a quiet, deliberate warning of exactly how far this could go for him personally. The initial ruling went against him. The panel found Lieutenant Whitfield guilty of acting without orders and exceeding his authority as a field officer during active operations. He was stripped of his rank on the spot, reduced to private, and confined pending further review, a sentence that landed on him not as a soldier being corrected for a mistake, but as a man being told, formally and in writing, that doing the right thing without permission was judged worse by his own army than doing nothing at all. As the schoolhouse door closed behind him, Staff Sergeant Grier stood in the cold hallway outside, still in uniform, watching the panel of officers file out past him without a word. One of them, a full colonel named Whitcomb, who had reviewed and quietly dismissed Whitfield's original battlefield report before it ever reached formal review, didn't look back once on his way out the door. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way these things almost always do, in fragments, weeks apart, from people who had no particular reason to lie about any of it. The first piece came from a forward reconnaissance unit that swept back through the ravine in late January, once the front had shifted further east, and found the burned wreckage of the depot sitting exactly where Whitfield had described it in his original report. Scorched fuel drums collapsed in on themselves, twisted half-track frames, and partially burned German engineering logs, still legible enough to be photographed and translated. The second piece came from a captured German supply officer, interrogated weeks later, and with no knowledge whatsoever of an American court-martial happening on the other side of the line, who confirmed under standard questioning that a forward fuel and ammunition cache in that exact sector had been destroyed in mid-December, forcing his unit to cancel a planned resupply movement that had been intended to support a wider offensive push scheduled for that stretch of the front. He hadn't known, and had no reason to care, that his answer would end up clearing an American lieutenant he'd never heard of. The third piece came from two survivors of the original missing American supply detachment, discovered alive in a German field hospital after being taken prisoner weeks earlier. Separately questioned, both confirmed they had spotted the same depot days before Whitfield's squad ever reached it, and had been captured trying to get a warning out. Exactly the missing piece Whitfield had guessed at from a few seconds of broken radio traffic back on that second night in the forest. Put together, piece by independent piece, the evidence was no longer something anyone could reasonably dismiss. Whitfield's squad hadn't stumbled onto some minor, inconsequential supply point in the woods. They had found and destroyed a marshalling depot feeding directly into a planned German push, and their action alone had forced the officers responsible for that push to cancel it outright rather than risk moving forward without the fuel and ammunition reserves they'd spent weeks quietly staging for exactly that purpose. And yet the recognition did not come quickly, and it did not come easily. Colonel Whitcomb, the officer who had dismissed the original report and pushed hardest for the court-martial to proceed as written, resisted reopening the case for weeks after the first pieces of confirming evidence had already reached his desk, arguing in written memoranda that reversing the ruling now would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging junior officers across the division to act outside the chain of command whenever they personally judged it necessary, regardless of what orders they'd actually been given. Other officers closer to Whitcomb admitted privately, in conversations that never made it into any official record, what almost nobody was willing to say out loud in front of a formal review board, that acknowledging Whitfield's squad had accomplished something an entire division's intelligence apparatus had missed entirely was, for career officers who had built their reputations on caution, process, and staying inside the lines, its own kind of quiet humiliation. It was simpler and considerably less costly to their own standing to keep calling it insubordination than to call it what the evidence increasingly showed it actually was. For enlisted men like Grier, watching all of this unfold from the outside of that process, it was hard not to feel the shape of what was happening. A junior officer had made the right call under conditions that offered him no good options, and the very institution that depended on men exactly like him to make exactly those calls when no one else could seemed, if anything, more uncomfortable acknowledging that he'd been right than it would have been simply writing him off as wrong. There was a particular detail that stuck with several of the men afterward, one that never made it into any official record but circulated quietly among the squad for years. When the confirming evidence from the captured supply officer first reached Whitcomb's desk, he reportedly set it aside for nearly 2 weeks before forwarding it to the review board, citing a backlog of higher priority reports. Nobody could ever prove it was deliberate. But nobody in Whitfield's squad ever quite believed it was an accident, either, not from a colonel who had already shown, in a schoolhouse in January, exactly how far he was willing to let things go rather than admit he'd misjudged a junior officer he'd never actually spoken to before the charges were filed. The review board finally overturned the conviction in March of 1945, nearly 3 months after the ravine, the explosion, and the schoolhouse. Whitfield's rank was restored, the charges formally dismissed, and a citation drafted acknowledging the squad's role in disrupting German logistics ahead of a planned offensive push in that stretch of the Ardennes. On paper, it read as a clean, complete vindication. It did not feel that way to the men who had lived it. It came 3 months late, after weeks Whitfield had spent stripped of rank and confined, after his name had already circulated informally through parts of the division as a cautionary tale about junior officers who thought they knew better than the men above them. Grier, Das, Bellamy, Meeks, and Coyle each received their own commendations for the mission, but none of them ever forgot standing in that cold schoolhouse hallway in January, watching a colonel who by March knew exactly how wrong he'd been walk past a man he'd helped strip of everything, without so much as a word. Colonel Whitcomb never publicly acknowledged that he had pushed the case as hard as he had, or that he'd sat on confirming evidence longer than the timeline could easily explain. He was transferred to a different sector 2 months later, and the surviving records show no formal reprimand ever attached to his name for any part of it. Whitfield finished the war with his rank restored and a citation in his personnel file, but he rarely spoke about those 6 days in the Ardennes or the court-martial that followed them for the rest of his life. Decades later, when finally asked directly about it, the only thing he was ever reportedly willing to say was that he would do it again, not because the Army had eventually thanked him for it, but because standing down and doing nothing had never actually felt like a real option to him in that ravine, whatever the officers who judged him afterward chose to believe about that. So the real question here was never really whether Lieutenant Whitfield made the right call. The evidence settled that a long time ago, in burned engineering logs and a prisoner's quiet confirmation, neither man knew would matter to anyone. The harder question is why an institution built, in theory, to reward exactly the kind of judgment he showed came so close to destroying the one man who actually showed it, and whether, given the same 6 days, the same silence, and the same impossible choice with no orders and no way to call for help, the officers who judged him from behind a desk would have made a different call themselves.